My name is Leon Wigrizer, and I graduated from law school in 1950. After graduation, I worked for a lawyer, a one-man firm, for the grand sum of $15 a week. And I looked around and I applied and got a job with the Internal Revenue Service. The Criminal Tax Division evaluated investigations that the agents had labeled as criminal. One of the major cases I remember was a very big congressman from Jersey and decided that we ought to prosecute. And I guess it got to the national office, and they were a little nervous because this was a big congressman. The chief counsel came in, Lester Uritz, never forget him, wonderful man. And we met, and he listened to my presentation and said, go ahead. So that was a very, very big feather in my cap. And from then on, we got a lot of other cases, and I evaluated them. The new chief counsel was very, very, very conservative, wonderful man. One afternoon, he called me down to his office, and the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, Don Alexander, was in the office. And they said, we're going to assign you a case to handle personally. Because at that time, I was chief of criminal tax for all over the country. And he handed me a file, and I looked at it, and it was Richard M. Nixon. As I was working on it, one Friday night, which I will never forget in my life, I got a call from the chief counsel. He said, can you come down? We're going to be busy tonight. You're coming with us. And he said, we're going to meet Leon Jaworski. I looked around the meeting. And first of all, I was the only non-presidential appointee. Everybody else in that room was appointed by Nixon. And here we are, ready to prosecute him. And who are they listening to? A non-Nixon appointee. And Jaworski came out, and he was a very, very affable Texan. And he says, tell me what you got. And I explained to him what we had. And that started the grand jury on Nixon. The investigation went on and on. There was a lot of loans and, quote, gifts from friends. But the grand jury didn't think it was strong enough to prosecute. If he had been prosecuted and convicted, he would have gone to jail.
Okay, at the time, what was your position with the Internal Revenue Service?
At that time, I was Deputy Chief Counsel of the Internal Revenue Service. Those were the exciting years, because in addition to what I was doing, I was getting calls from our staff all over the country who had cases and wanted to discuss them and get opinions. The Chief Counsel of Treasury was a guy named Robert MUNDHEIM. One afternoon he called and he said, Leon, come over, I'd like to talk to you. And he told me all about the Inspector General was to look at all kinds of fraud, abuse, criminals, any violation of internal rules and regulations. And then one afternoon I met Blumenthal. We talked about the job, and he said to me, would you like it? And I said, yeah. I mean, it's something exciting, something different. And I took that job and moved over to Treasury. And in that job, we handled soup to nuts. I mean, people who were crooked internally, people who were not doing what they're supposed to do. We even had a relative of the Carter family who was allegedly doing some improprieties. And it didn't, we investigated it, but it didn't work out. And I stayed in Treasury, and I liked it very much. I dealt with some, not many, but a few people in the White House. But one thing I'll never forget, I was called before a committee of Congress to discuss a case. And I figured this is hard enough. So I called the secretary. And he says, handle it the way you want it. And I said, well, I'll handle it the way it is. I'm not gonna. And I felt that we weren't getting guidance, but on the other hand, it was honest. No one told me what to say, no one told me how to say it. But there's one funny incident I remember being in the White House Treasury. Carter used to run around the track with his wife every day, probably in the afternoon. And since my office overlooked the White House, I used to be able to see him. And one day the telephone rang, and one of the Secret Service men, who I knew very well, said, "Leon, tell your secretary to get the hell off the window ledge with the ruler, because she may not live to tell about it." Because they wouldn't know whether it was a gun or who she was. They really watched everything when the president is out. We were literally an alleyway apart from the White House. And after Reagan was appointed, the next day, everyone's yelling, "Clean up your office quickly." Reagan got up in the White House and walked across the street and came to shake hands with people in Treasury. And I thought that was a very, very nice. He was a good-looking man, very tall and very, very affable. When I retired from Treasury and we lived in Bethesda, Maryland, I didn't know what I was going to do. So we moved back to Philadelphia, and I was just going to retire. And one day, a friend of mine who was a judge here in Philadelphia called me and said that I went to a meeting with the mayor, who was good, in Harrisburg, and he was telling me he's thinking of setting up an IG, and I gave him your name. I got a call from Good, and he said, "I've looked into you and I would like you to be my Inspector General." I said, "Well, I'm not so sure." I went down there, and of course I took the job. He was very persuasive. I was Inspector General of the city about 7 years, and I worked on cases from heads of agencies to inspectors who were taking a dime, as they call it in the trade.
There's an old saying, will it pass the smell test? Regardless of what code of ethics you have, regardless of anything, this won't pass the smell test, in my view.
And I'll never forget, an inspector came in and said, "You've got to do this. But if you want to see me at 3 o'clock, we'll work it out." So we set it up with cameras and everything, and the inspector came to see him at 3, and the cop handed him the money. And they arrested him on the spot, and that was on Channel 6 all night. But I had like 250 or 260 arrests in my career at the city, so it was a big deal. There was a lawyer I used to work with in IRS, Clayton Underkoffler, and he was on the board at SEPTA. And he said, "Leon, I've been after SEPTA to get an Inspector General." And Lou Gambaccini from New Jersey was just hired to be the new general manager. I was offered the job. They were looking for any bribes for hiring and for purchasing. Like, we used to buy tons of coal and tons of oil. And to make sure that we got the best price, we wanted to make sure that it really was an open bidding. And my career in SEPTA was very good. I really enjoyed that. My one piece of advice to both my children and my grandchildren was to be ethical.